I'm playing Tekken 8, and I have some specific movements that just don't work reliably enough. Like a spinning move after a dragonfly stance. I can perfectly perform this input 10 times in a row, but there is always is the next execution where misinput happens. I may try to push buttons harder. I even changed the gamepad twice, but I still cannot achieve perfect 100% chance execution. But what if? What if it's not always my mistake? What if something is wrong, deep inside the game itself? I have to check this. I need someone who I can blame for my losses. So I made a script that emulates gamepad input. It emulates the exact same input over and over again, with machine level of precision. It works perfectly, as intended. So all misinput happens because I'm the scrub. Get good, video is over. What? Why did this happen? The game gets the exact same input over and over. Why sometimes it reacts differently? To understand this, we need to understand how applications take user input. So, nerdy stuff starts here. There are two basic approaches of how your application may handle the input from keyboard, mouse, or game controller. The first is used by applications like text editors or web browsers. Those apps just wait until your operating system will send them a message about pressed key or mouse click. You press the key, your operation system receives information about this and sends a message to your application. Text editor receives the message, and your text appears on the screen. It is very simplified, but good enough for now. Video games do not behave like this. Tekken, like most of the video games, doesn't wait for a message. It checks user input frame by frame. That means that the game has no idea what is happening between frames. Only which button is pressed at exact time the game is checking your input. So, if you somehow are able to press a button for just a 1 millisecond, you have to find out that the game is almost never able to react to this input. Such a quick pressing is just invisible for the game most of the time. But sometimes the game is still able to do that. It depends when exactly you press the button for just a millisecond. If you do it somewhere between the frames, the game simply cannot react to this. But if you press it right before the input check, your character on the screen will start to move. So let's check our input script again. It emulates input perfectly, but it pushes virtual buttons not like a machine, but more like a real human. And like a real human, it is almost impossible to press multiple buttons exactly at the same time. There is always a little time gap between button pressing. It can be just a 1 millisecond. It is just 0.001 of a second. So small, but it's here. It probably isn't related to this guy, of course. So, script moving us to the helicopter stance. Nothing special here. After 40 milliseconds, it presses 1, and right after 1 more millisecond, it presses forward 1 plus 2. Most of the time, it executes the spinning move, but sometimes we start our sequence right before the input checks. If it happens, the game reacts only for the 1, but not for forward 1 plus 2. Of course, game developers are aware about this problem. Tekken has mechanics like input buffering. Some characters almost do not have an input that requires pressing multiple buttons at the same time. They mostly rely on the sequence of buttons instead. But we cannot always use the input buffering, and we have characters like Yoshimitsu, who heavily depends on pressing multiple buttons at the exact time. At the end, certain moves became not a skill issue, but mostly a gambling game. If you start a move at the very beginning of the frame, you have almost a 16 millisecond time window. But if buttons are pressed right before the input check, you are in bad luck. Of course, skilled players may make both type of inputs more reliable by pressing buttons more precisely. But if you aren't this guy, you are still playing in casino here. It leads to frustration for a player. You understand that you are pressing buttons the same way. Sometimes the game is doing what you want, but sometimes it is not. Is it possible to do something about it? Well, I made the script. Don't be surprised. It creates a virtual gamepad. This fake gamepad takes input from the real one, making some techno sorcery with this data and passing new, cleaned input into the game. But what type of sorcery is used here? Instead of sending input immediately after receiving, it waits an additional 8 milliseconds, half of the frame, and after that sends all buttons that have been pressed for that time. That's all. Nothing complicated here. But how well does it work? I ran the same move for 10 minutes straight. First 5 minutes I didn't use the script, and the last 5 minutes I used it. For the first 5 minutes I made 28 mistakes, and only 10 mistakes after enabling, almost 3 times less. So it works. I'm really happy with the result. I like to know that using certain moves isn't a question of luck now. You press everything in an 8 millisecond window or you don't. That's it. It feels reliable and very satisfying. But here's the problem. Some piece of software that gives an advantage over your opponent. Is it a description of cheating? On the one hand, the game already allows you to map multiple buttons on the bumpers or any other single button of the gamepad. We also have input buffering, and different controllers can be better or worse in comparison with each other. But cheating is cheating. So I decided to not use this software after testing, even if it using feels really, really good. I never felt so confident in my game moves. Another question is why do developers not put this mechanism inside the game if it works so well? I don't know. I'm sure there are some reasons for that. Maybe it works well for me, but for some sweaty main of Kaza who has wasted thousands of hours building muscle memory to perfectly execute electric, it may not be that good, and those players wouldn't like it. Maybe it's simply impossible to implement on game consoles, even on decent game devices. I have to use some hacks to implement this. And there is a high chance that they need to modify the game engine to implement this properly inside the game. Trust me, you don't want to touch this piece of C++ code without a good reason. Maybe it's just a power of habit. Remember, they have been making this game for more than 30 years. Implementing such a system isn't possible on PlayStation 1, for example. Ask me how I know. Maybe developers will view this video and implement this feature inside the game. Maybe in Tekken 9 even. It can be an option that can be disabled at any time, so sweaty players with hard skill may not use it. But any scrap like me can get a more reliable input. Maybe. I have not solved the problem, but I achieved my main goal. Now I know who I can blame for my losses.